In this video, we're talking about inverted menses, or nosebleed during the period. Is this a real thing? What causes it? And how is it treated? So this wasn't a direct question, but it was something that popped up on my Instagram a while back. This person wrote, "I have a fun new PMS symptom. Every month before my period, I've been getting a nosebleed. This has happened the last 4 cycles. Is this a real thing?" Well, it turns out that yes, this is a real thing, and it even has a name in Chinese medicine. This is called Daojing, inverted menstruation, or Nijing, counterflow menstruation. And this just refers to nosebleed that occurs during or around the period. And it turns out that this character Ni is also often translated as rebellion. Like when we say rebellious stomach chi, that's the same character Ni. So normally stomach chi is supposed to go downward and downbear the food into the small intestine. But if the chi rebels upward, that can give us symptoms like nausea and vomiting. Well, the same thing is happening here with menstruation. Normally the blood is supposed to move downward, but instead it's rebelling upwards, giving us nosebleed. So what causes this to happen? Well, remember in TCM we have several causes of bleeding. We can have blood stasis causing bleeding, heat in the blood causing bleeding, or deficiency causing bleeding. So with blood stasis, you can think that there's an area of stagnation in the vessels, so the blood has to go around it and it ends up going outside of the vessels, causing bleeding. Or another way I think about it is with a high pressure hose or pipe, if there's some blockage in the pipe, the pressure behind it will build up and cause the pipe to burst at the seams. So blood stasis can cause bleeding. With heat, the idea here is heat causes things to speed up. So when heat gets into the blood, it speeds up the movement of blood so much that it begins to move recklessly or frenetically outside of the vessels, causing bleeding. With deficiency, we're usually talking about deficiency cold, and we're usually talking about the spleen. Remember, the spleen has a function of holding the blood inside the vessels. So if the spleen is deficient, the blood can leak out, resulting in bleeding. So when it comes to our issue of inverted menstruation, this is of course a bleeding condition, and this is usually bleeding due to heat. So when we look at Wiseman's Practical Dictionary of Chinese Medicine, he says, counterflow menstruation is the passing of blood through the mouth or nose during or around menstruation. He goes on to say, counterflow menstruation occurring before or during menstruation is usually attributable to congestion of internal heat forcing the blood to rise. So heat causes things to rise, so the blood rises up and out the nose. In Wiseman and Brand's Concise Materia Medica, they say something similar. Inverted menstruation is nosebleed during the menstrual period, usually due to liver depression transforming into fire that invades the lung. So here, the idea is we start with liver qi stagnation, or liver constraint. That stagnation turns into heat, which then goes into the lung. And remember, the lung opens to the nose, so this heat in the lung causes nosebleed. And when we talk about heat going from the liver to the lung, remember that these organs have a relationship along the Ke cycle, or controlling cycle. So this is maybe not a super common pattern, but we can have cases of wood insulting metal or wood rebelling against metal, where heat from the liver can go into the lung, causing things like coughing and wheezing, or in this case, nosebleed. So how would we treat this? Well, it turns out that we did learn one herb that is specifically indicated for inverted menses, and that herb was Eugene, curcuma radix from the invigorate blood category. So Eugene is really good for invigorating blood, moving qi, and resolving constraint, but remember that it also has this action of cooling the blood to stop bleeding. And if we look very carefully in Bensky, we'll note that under this function, he says that Eugene is especially useful for nosebleed at the onset of menstruation or instead of menstruation, known as inverted menses, Daojing. If we wanted to look at herbal formulas, there is one formula that is specifically indicated for inverted menses, and that is San Huang Siwutong, 3 yellow and 4 substance decoction. Now, this is not a very commonly discussed formula, but we can see here that it's just the three yellows, Huang Qin, Huang Lian, Huang Bai, plus our basic blood tonifying formula, Siwu Tong. And this is indicated for nosebleed or coughing up blood 2 days prior to the onset of menstruation. But to be honest, in the few cases of inverted menses that I have seen, I've never really been inclined to use this formula. It just doesn't really make sense to me. Like, why would you necessarily use the three huangs to clear this type of heat? And why would you use Siwu Tong? Because like we saw in Wiseman and Brand, this condition is usually caused by liver qi stagnation that turns into heat. And this has been my experience as well. The patients I've seen often have other signs of liver qi stagnation as well, such as irritability or short temper, breast tenderness or breast pain, painful cramps, and often delayed menses, or the period is late due to qi and blood stagnation. So to me, it makes more sense to choose a formula that treats both the heat and the underlying stagnation as well. So I would usually go to something like Jia Wei Xiao San. Remember, regular Xiao San is good for liver qi stagnation or liver overacting on spleen, but here the Jia Wei means we're adding Mudan Pi and Zhi to clear heat. So this version of the formula treats the underlying liver qi stagnation, and it also clears the heat that results from it, which is exactly what we want. From there, I would add in other herbs specifically for the bleeding, like we talked about with Yu Jin. And I think Yu Jin is especially fitting here because not only does it cool the blood and stop bleeding, it also moves qi and blood to relieve liver constraint. In fact, the Yu in Yu Jin literally means constraint. So it's like with this one herb, we're treating both the root and the branch. Another one I might also think about is Niu Shi. This one also comes from the invigorate blood category. Besides invigorating blood, it also directs heat downward and guides blood to descend. So it's used for bleeding conditions in the upper body, like nosebleed. I also like this one for delayed menses or late period due to stagnation because it moves blood and it moves it downward. Just remember that because of this downward nature, it's contraindicated with heavy menstruation and during pregnancy. And then I might think about other stop bleeding herbs as well, like Ojie, lotus root node, or Bai Mao Gen, impurity rhizoma. Both of these herbs enter the lung channel and can be used for nosebleed. So what about treatment using acupuncture? Well, as far as I know, there aren't any acupuncture points that are specifically indicated for inverted menses. But remember that one of our most famous points for stopping bleeding is spleen 1. Like we said, one of the functions of the spleen is to control the blood and hold it inside the vessels. So that's why we can use spleen 1 to stop bleeding. And for this point, I feel like most people think of spleen 1 for uterine bleeding, like heavy menses or spotting between periods, and usually for bleeding due to deficiency. But it turns out that spleen 1 can be used for upper body bleeding as well, like vomiting blood and nosebleed, and it can be used for bleeding due to excess or deficiency. So for bleeding due to deficiency cold, you might use moxa on spleen 1, but for bleeding due to excess heat, you might needle spleen 1 or even prick to bleed spleen 1. Another interesting one that you might not think about is lung 3. Now, I think normally we think of lung 3 as being a window of heaven point. It calms the corporeal soul, so it can be used for sadness and grief. But lung 3 also has an action of clearing lung heat and cooling the blood and stopping bleeding, especially in cases where liver fire is attacking the lung. Even the Ling Shu says lung 3 can be used when liver and lung struggle against each other and blood overflows from the mouth and nose. Besides that, I would just think about points that treat the underlying pattern. So I might use liver 3 and Li4 because that pair is good for moving liver qi. Also, Li4 is the command point of the face, and your nose is on your face, so it can treat nosebleed. And because this is liver heat going into the lung, I might think about points like lung 5 as well to clear lung heat. But basically, just treat the underlying pattern. And just a few extra notes on inverted menses. It turns out we have a similar condition called deviated menses, or cha-jing, which is blood in the stool that occurs during or around menstruation. This is a similar pathomechanism, but instead of the heat going up into the lung and causing bleeding, the heat is going sideways into the intestines and causing bleeding. Honestly, this isn't something I've ever seen clinically, so I don't know how common it is. And finally, it might be interesting to point out that this is a thing in Western medicine as well. There they call it vicarious menstruation, and this can refer to any type of bleeding other than uterine bleeding that occurs periodically around the time of normal menstruation. I think the most common form is bleeding from the nose, but there are reports of bleeding from other tissues like the eyes, ears, intestines, nipples, or even the skin. And I think this is often related to endometriosis. So that's just another interesting tidbit. And before we go, real quick, I want to tell you about a product called Dragon Blood Balm. Speaking of bleeding, there is another cause of bleeding in TCM, which is, of course, injury and trauma. And one of our most famous herbs for injury and trauma is shui jie, or dragon's blood. Now, we don't always learn this one in school, but it's another tree sap similar to ruxiang and mo yao. It invigorates blood and stops pain. It can be applied topically to stop bleeding, and it regenerates flesh. So all of these actions together make it a very important herb for treating injury and trauma. So much so that it's often a key ingredient in trauma liniments like zhenggu shuis and dittijiaos, and it's also the key ingredient in dragon blood balm. So this is like a dittijiao in balm form. It was made by some acupuncturist rock climbers to help heal their hands after tough rock climbing sessions. But because it has all these blood invigorating herbs, it's really good for all kinds of disorders of the skin, muscles, and tendons. And because it's in balm form, I think it's actually a lot easier to apply than the traditional alcohol-based dittijiaos. If you want to try it out, there's a link below. You can use the coupon code ND15 to get 15% off your entire order. Full disclosure, this is an affiliate link, which means I'll receive a small commission, but this is a way that you can support the channel at no additional cost to you. And if you're a practitioner, this is also a great product to sell in your clinic, especially if you're dealing with sports injuries or if you have patients who are already using Tiger Balm. This could be a good product to use with a little more TCM oomph. So I'll leave a link below where you can set up a wholesale account as well. But that's all for this one. If you want to see more videos about case studies or Q&A, check out this one over here, and we'll see you in the next one.